Take a calm breath. Get into a comfortable position and slowly relax. Now I'm letting you drift into the flow of the story. The morning began like any other morning in the city. You woke up in your small apartment and listened to the distant sounds of traffic outside your window. Cars moved through the streets. People hurried to work. Somewhere below, a bus stopped and then continued down the road. For years, this had been your daily life. Busy streets. Crowded buildings. The constant noise of a city that never seemed to rest. But today felt different. Today was the day you were leaving. A few weeks earlier, you had found a strange job advertisement. A forgotten botanical garden in a small town was looking for a new caretaker. The position included a small cottage inside the garden and the responsibility of maintaining the grounds. Most people probably ignored the advertisement. But something about it stayed in your mind. You imagined quiet walking paths. Old glass houses covered with ivy. Birdsong instead of traffic. And for reasons you could not fully explain, you decided to apply. A few days later, you received a letter. The job was yours. Now, standing in your apartment surrounded by packed boxes, you wondered how much your life was about to change. You took one final look around the room. Then you picked up your suitcase and left. The train station was busy when you arrived. People were saying goodbye to family members, carrying bags, and rushing toward their platforms. You found your seat beside a window. Soon, the train slowly pulled away from the city. Tall buildings disappeared behind you. Roads became smaller. The landscape opened into wide fields and rolling hills. As the hours passed, you felt yourself becoming calmer. The noise of the city seemed very far away now. You watched farms, forests, and small villages pass by outside. The sky was clear. The sunlight moved gently across the countryside. For the first time in a long while, you felt no pressure to hurry anywhere. Late in the afternoon, the train arrived at a small station. The town was quiet. Only a few people stepped off the train. A cool breeze moved through the platform. You picked up your suitcase and looked around. Somewhere beyond the hills stood the forgotten botanical garden that would become your new home. You did not know what waited for you there. But as the evening sun began to set, you felt something you had not felt in years. A quiet sense of possibility. And with that feeling, you started walking toward your new life. The road leading to the botanical garden was quiet. As you walked away from the train station, the town slowly disappeared behind you. The streets became narrower, and the houses became fewer. Soon, there was only a winding road between green hills. The evening air felt fresh. You could hear birds singing somewhere in the distance. After nearly 30 minutes of walking, you finally saw it. An old iron gate stood beside the road. The words Rosewood Botanical Garden were still written above it, although some of the letters had faded with time. You stopped for a moment. This was the place. The place that had brought you all the way from the city. The gate was slightly open. When you pushed it gently, it moved with a long, quiet creak. Beyond the gate, a stone path disappeared into a sea of trees and plants. You stepped inside. The garden was larger than you expected. Tall trees lined the paths. Wild flowers grew freely beside the walkways. Some areas looked carefully designed long ago, while others had clearly been left untouched for years. Nature had slowly begun reclaiming the garden. Yet the place did not feel abandoned. It felt peaceful. Almost as if it had simply been waiting. You continued along the main path. As the sun moved lower in the sky, golden light filtered through the branches above. Dust floated through the warm evening air. Everything seemed calm. Everything seemed slow. Eventually, you reached a small cottage near the center of the garden. The building was simple. It had a stone chimney, wooden walls, and a small porch facing a pond. This would be your home. You unlocked the front door with the key that had been mailed to you. Inside, the cottage was modest but comfortable. There was a small kitchen, a wooden table, a bookshelf, and near the window stood an old armchair. Someone had clearly prepared the cottage before your arrival. Your suitcase felt lighter as you placed it beside the bed. For the first time all day, you sat down and rested. The room was silent. No traffic. No sirens. No voices from neighboring apartments. Only the distant sound of leaves moving in the wind. As evening slowly turned into night, you decided to explore a little more. You walked outside and followed a narrow path toward the pond. The water reflected the colors of the sunset. Orange. Gold, soft shades of pink. A few ducks moved quietly across the surface. Nearby, you noticed the outline of a large glasshouse. Its windows reflected the last light of the day. Many of the glass panels were covered by climbing plants. The structure looked old. Older than anything else in the garden. You wondered what was growing inside. But that could wait until tomorrow. There would be plenty of time. Tonight, you simply stood beside the pond and watched the sky grow darker. One by one, the first stars appeared. A cool breeze moved across the water. The garden seemed even more peaceful beneath the evening sky. For the first time in many years, you felt completely disconnected from the busy world you had left behind. There were no deadlines here. No crowded streets. No rushing from place to place. Only quiet paths. Growing plants. And the promise of a slower life. As darkness settled over the garden, you returned to the cottage. Tomorrow would be your first full day as the caretaker. But tonight, surrounded by the gentle sounds of nature, you allowed yourself to simply rest. And before long, sleep came easily. The next morning, you woke up before sunrise. For a few moments, you remained in bed, listening. The cottage was completely quiet. Then, slowly, you began to hear the sounds of the garden waking up. A bird sang somewhere outside. Leaves rustled gently in the morning breeze. In the distance, water trickled softly into the pond. The sounds were simple. Yet they felt more peaceful than anything you had heard in the city. You got out of bed and walked to the window. A thin layer of mist rested over the garden. The paths were still empty. The trees stood silently beneath the pale blue sky. As the first sunlight appeared over the hills, the glasshouse in the distance began to glow softly. For a moment, the entire garden seemed golden. After a simple breakfast, you stepped outside. Today was your first day as the caretaker. There was no schedule waiting for you. No manager giving instructions. Only the garden itself. You decided to start by exploring. A gravel path led you deeper into the grounds. The further you walked, the more details you noticed. Small flowers grew between cracks in the stone paths. Old wooden signs pointed toward different sections of the garden. Some signs were easy to read. Others had faded so much that only a few letters remained. You followed one sign that pointed toward the eastern greenhouse. The building stood at the edge of a small hill. Up close, it looked even older. Many of the windows were covered with vines. A few glass panels were cracked. The wooden door had weathered under years of sun and rain. You gently pushed it open. The hinges creaked softly. Warm air greeted you from inside. The greenhouse was larger than you expected. Rows of plants filled the space. Some looked healthy, others clearly needed attention. Sunlight streamed through the dusty glass above. Tiny particles floated through the air. You slowly walked between the rows. There were ferns. Orchids, tall tropical plants, and many species you did not recognize. Near the back wall, you discovered an old wooden desk. A layer of dust covered its surface. Beside it sat a leather-bound notebook. Curious, you picked it up. The cover was worn with age. When you opened it, you found neat handwritten notes. Dates. Plant names. Watering schedules. Observations about growth and flowering seasons. The notebook clearly belonged to one of the garden's former caretakers. You turned a few pages. The entries stretched back many years. Some pages included sketches of rare plants. Others described weather patterns and seasonal changes. It felt less like a work journal and more like a personal diary of the garden itself. You carefully closed the notebook. There would be time to read it later. For now, you placed it safely inside your bag. Outside, the morning continued to grow brighter. The mist had disappeared. Sunlight filled the paths. The garden no longer felt forgotten. It felt alive, waiting patiently, ready for a new chapter. And as you stood in the center of the old greenhouse, surrounded by growing things, you realized something. You were no longer simply visiting this place. Little by little, it was becoming your home. Over the next few days, you settled into a gentle routine. Each morning, you walked through a different part of the garden. You checked the greenhouses. You watered the plants that needed attention. You removed fallen branches from the paths. The work was simple, but it felt satisfying. Unlike your old life in the city, there was no rush. The garden moved at its own pace. And slowly, you began to move at the same pace too. One cool morning, while exploring an area near the northern edge of the garden, you noticed something unusual. Behind a group of tall bushes stood an old stone marker. Most of it was hidden by ivy. You brushed away some of the leaves and discovered a word carved into the stone. Woodland walk. You looked around. There was no visible path. Only thick plants and wild grass. Yet the marker suggested that a path had once existed here. Curious, you searched nearby. After a few minutes, you found it. Beneath layers of leaves and overgrown plants, a narrow stone walkway appeared. Time had almost erased it. Almost. You decided to follow it. The path twisted gently between old trees. Sunlight filtered through the branches above, creating moving patterns on the ground. The further you walked, the quieter the garden became. Even the birds seemed distant here. It felt like entering a forgotten corner of another world. Nature had transformed the place over many years. Wildflowers covered parts of the walkway. Moss grew between the stones. Small ferns lined the edges of the path. Everything looked untouched, as though no one had walked there for a very long time. You continued deeper into the woodland area. Eventually, the path opened into a small clearing. You stopped. In the center stood a circular stone bench. Around it grew dozens of flowering plants. Most were unfamiliar to you. Their colors were soft and beautiful. White, pale blue, light purple. The flowers moved gently in the breeze. For a moment, everything was perfectly still. You sat down on the bench. The air smelled fresh. The leaves above whispered quietly in the wind. Somewhere nearby, a small stream flowed through the trees. You wondered why this place had been forgotten. It was one of the most peaceful areas you had seen in the entire garden. Perhaps visitors had once come here to read, or think, or simply enjoy the silence. You opened your bag and took out the old notebook from the greenhouse. Carefully turning the pages, you searched for any mention of the woodland path. After several minutes, you found it. The entry was dated nearly 20 years ago. The caretaker had written, "The woodland walk remains my favorite part of the garden. It is quiet even on busy days. Whenever I need to think, I come here and sit among the flowers." You smiled. It seemed that even years ago, someone had felt exactly the same way. You closed the notebook and looked around once more. The clearing no longer felt abandoned. It felt remembered. As if the garden had been waiting for someone to find this place again. And now, after many years of silence, someone finally had. You remained on the stone bench until the afternoon sunlight began to soften. Then, slowly, you stood and started walking back. You knew you would return. Some places simply felt special from the very first visit. And this was one of them. A week passed quietly in the garden. Each morning, you woke up to birdsong. Each evening, you watched the sunlight fade across the pond. The days felt slower here. Longer. More peaceful. You no longer checked the time every hour. You no longer felt the need to hurry. The garden had its own rhythm, and little by little, You became part of it. One morning, while working inside the eastern greenhouse, something caught your attention. Near one of the far windows stood a plant you had seen several times before. It grew in a large clay pot. Long green leaves spread outward from its center. At first glance, it looked ordinary. But today was different. A single flower bud had appeared. You knelt beside the pot. The bud was small and tightly closed. Its pale color stood out among the dark green leaves. You remembered seeing this plant in the old notebook. Carefully, you searched through the pages. After a few minutes, you found it. The plant's name was silver dawn lily. According to the notes, it was one of the rarest flowers in the entire garden. More importantly, it only bloomed once every few years. The previous caretaker had written several entries about it. One note read, "When the silver dawn lily blooms, it reminds us that some beautiful things cannot be rushed. They arrive only when the time is right." You looked at the bud again. It seemed almost impossible that something so small had waited years for this moment. Over the next few days, checking the flower became part of your routine. Every morning, you visited the greenhouse. Every morning, the bud was slightly larger. The changes were tiny, almost invisible. Yet they were there. You began looking forward to those quiet visits. There was something comforting about watching a living thing grow so patiently. No deadlines. No pressure. Just time. One evening, after finishing your work, you stopped by the greenhouse as usual. The sun was beginning to set. Golden light filled the room. And then you saw it. The flower had opened. Not completely, but enough. Soft silver-white petals unfolded from the center. Their edges seemed to glow in the evening sunlight. The flower was beautiful. Not because it was bright or dramatic, but because it was gentle. Quiet. Almost hidden. You stood there for several minutes without speaking. The greenhouse was silent. The air was warm. Outside, the garden was preparing for another peaceful night. At that moment, you understood why the former caretaker had written so much about this flower. It was not simply a rare plant. It was a reminder. A reminder that not everything in life needed to happen quickly. Some things required patience. Some things required seasons. And some of the most beautiful moments arrived only after long periods of waiting. As darkness slowly settled outside, you took one final look at the silver dawn lily. Then you closed the greenhouse door and started walking back toward the cottage. The flower would still be there tomorrow. And the day after that. For now, it was enough simply knowing that you had been there when it finally bloomed. The days continued to pass peacefully. Spring was slowly arriving. New leaves appeared on the trees. Flowers began opening across the garden. The pond reflected bright blue skies instead of winter clouds. Every morning seemed a little warmer than the one before. One quiet afternoon, while trimming a row of bushes near the main entrance, you heard a sound. Footsteps. You looked up. A woman was standing near the gate. She appeared to be in her 70s. She wore a light brown coat and carried a small woven basket. For a moment, she simply stood there, looking into the garden. Almost as if she could not believe what she was seeing. You walked over and greeted her. The woman smiled warmly. "Good afternoon," she said. "Good afternoon," you replied. She looked around slowly. Her eyes moved from the paths to the trees, then toward the distant greenhouse. "It has been many years since I was here," she said quietly. You noticed a hint of emotion in her voice. The garden clearly meant something to her. You invited her inside. Together, you walked along the main path. She moved slowly but seemed to know exactly where she was going. At different corners of the garden, she would occasionally stop. Sometimes she smiled. Sometimes she simply stood in silence. Eventually, you reached the pond. The woman sat on a wooden bench beside the water. For a few moments, neither of you spoke. The afternoon breeze moved across the pond. Ducks drifted peacefully near the reeds. Finally, she turned toward you. When I was a child, she said, my father brought me here every Sunday. You listened quietly. The garden was much busier back then. Families walked along the paths. Children ran near the pond. The greenhouses were full of visitors. She smiled at the memory. I loved this place. Her gaze settled on the water. When it closed, many people thought it would disappear forever. You looked around. The trees. The flowers. The paths. It was difficult to imagine the garden filled with crowds. Now, its greatest beauty seemed to be its silence. The woman seemed to understand your thoughts. It is different now, she said. But not worse. You glanced toward her. She smiled. In some ways, I think it is even more beautiful. The two of you remained beside the pond for a while longer. Then she reached into her basket and removed a small envelope. I wanted to give you this, she said. You carefully opened it. Inside was an old photograph. The picture showed the botanical garden many years ago. The trees were smaller. The greenhouse looked newer. Dozens of people filled the paths. Children stood beside flower beds, smiling toward the camera. You looked at the photograph, then at the garden around you. The difference was remarkable. And yet, somehow, the spirit of the place felt the same. The woman stood and prepared to leave. Before walking away, she turned one last time. Thank you for taking care of it, she said. You were surprised. I've only been here a short time. She nodded. Sometimes that's enough. Then she smiled and slowly walked toward the gate. You watched until she disappeared down the road. Later that evening, sitting on the cottage porch, you looked at the old photograph again. The garden had changed. The people had changed. The years had passed. But the garden remained, growing quietly through every season. And now, for a small part of its story, you were part of it too. A few days after meeting the visitor, you found yourself thinking about the old photograph. You kept it safely inside the cottage and looked at it from time to time. Each time, you noticed a new detail. A flower bed. A stone bench. A pathway that no longer existed. One afternoon, while comparing the photograph with the garden around you, something caught your attention. Near the far edge of the picture, behind a group of trees, stood a small building. It looked like a greenhouse. You frowned. You had explored most of the garden by now. Yet you did not remember seeing a greenhouse in that location. Curious, you studied the photograph more closely. The structure was definitely there. Small. Made of glass. Almost hidden among the trees. You decided to investigate. The next morning, after finishing your usual work, you headed toward the western side of the garden. This area was less maintained than the rest. The paths were narrow. Bushes had grown thick over the years. Some sections were nearly impossible to walk through. For almost an hour, you searched. At times, you wondered if the greenhouse had been demolished long ago. Then, just as you were about to turn back, you noticed something unusual. A metal frame. Partially hidden beneath climbing vines. Your heart lifted. You pushed aside several branches and stepped forward. There it was. The greenhouse from the photograph. Or at least what remained of it. The building was much smaller than the eastern greenhouse. Its glass panels were covered with dirt and moss. Some were cracked. Others had disappeared completely. Nature had slowly wrapped itself around the structure. Yet somehow it was still standing. You approached carefully. The old wooden door was almost hidden beneath layers of ivy. With a gentle pull, it opened. A cool breath of air drifted out. You stepped inside. Dust covered nearly everything. Sunlight entered through broken sections of glass. Plants grew freely across the floor. For a moment, it felt less like a building and more like a small indoor forest. You moved slowly through the room. The greenhouse seemed untouched. As if nobody had entered it for many years. Near the back wall, you discovered a workbench. Old gardening tools rested upon it. Most were covered in rust. Beside them stood several clay pots. And in the center of the bench sat a small wooden box. You brushed away the dust. The box was simple but well made. Carefully, you lifted the lid. Inside, you found dozens of paper packets. Each packet carried a handwritten label. Seeds. You picked one up. The handwriting matched the notebook you had found earlier. These seeds had belonged to the former caretaker. Some labels named flowers you recognized. Others listed plants you had never heard of before. You turned over one packet and noticed a short note. For future seasons. You stood quietly. The words felt surprisingly moving. Years ago, someone had placed these seeds here. They had expected future caretakers to find them. Perhaps they had hoped the garden would continue long after they were gone. And now, standing inside the hidden greenhouse, you had become part of that future. You carefully placed the packets back into the box. There would be time to study them later. Outside, sunlight filtered through the trees. The garden remained peaceful. But now it felt slightly different. Not because the garden had changed, but because you had discovered another piece of its story. A story that had been waiting patiently beneath vines and dust. A story that was no longer forgotten. That night, you could not stop thinking about the seeds. They were still inside the wooden box in the hidden greenhouse, but in your mind, they felt closer than that. As if they were waiting for you. Quietly. Patiently. The next morning, you returned. The hidden greenhouse looked the same as before. Broken glass. Soft light. Wild plants growing freely inside. But now, it felt different to you. Less abandoned. More intentional. You opened the wooden box again. Carefully, you looked through the seed packets one by one. Some were labeled with familiar names. Others were completely unknown. You hesitated for a long time. Then you chose one. The label read, Moon Vine. There was no description. Only that single word. You held the packet in your hand. It felt surprisingly light. As if it carried something more than seeds. You decided to plant it near the center of the greenhouse, where the light was strongest. Using a small trowel, you cleared a patch of soil. The ground was soft and slightly warm under the sunlight. You worked slowly, carefully, without rush. When you finally placed the seeds into the soil, nothing happened. Of course nothing happened. You knew that. Still, you found yourself staring at the spot for a long time, as if waiting for a sign. Then you covered the seeds gently with soil and watered them. After that, you simply sat on the old bench inside the greenhouse. For a while, you did nothing. You just listened. To the wind outside. To the faint creaking of the structure. To the quiet life of the garden around you. Days passed. Then weeks. You continued your routine in the main garden. But every morning, you visited the hidden greenhouse. The moon vine did not show itself immediately. There were no visible changes at first. Only soil, only time. One evening, as summer slowly deepened, you noticed something. A thin green shoot had appeared. Barely visible. Almost easy to miss. But it was there. You leaned closer. A small part of the plant had finally decided to exist above the surface. You did not say anything. You did not call anyone. You simply watched. The same way you had watched the silver dawn lily bloom. The same way you had learned to watch everything here. Slowly. Patiently. Without expectation. Over the following days, the shoot grew stronger. A delicate vine began to form. It wrapped gently around a small support you placed beside it. The plant seemed to know where to go. As if it remembered something you did not. One night, you stayed in the greenhouse longer than usual. The garden outside was dark. The sky was full of stars. Inside, the moon vine had grown noticeably larger. Its leaves shimmered faintly under the moonlight filtering through the broken glass. And then you saw it. A small bud. Forming at the end of the vine. You did not know when it had appeared. But it was there now. You leaned back on the bench and exhaled slowly. Nothing dramatic had happened. No sudden change. No grand moment. Just something small. Something alive. Something becoming. And for the first time, you realized something simple. This garden did not need to be fixed. It only needed to be cared for. And you were already doing exactly that.